I was forced out of my brother's house when his wife got pregnant. Now they're facing eviction and expect me to help, but she still won't apologize. All right, I could really use some outside perspective on this situation, as I'm feeling pretty torn. A few years ago, I, 28F, was living with my older brother Tom, 37M, and his wife Karen, 34F. I had just graduated from college, was stuck in a terrible job, and was struggling to make ends meet. Tom and Karen owned a house with an extra room, and Tom offered to let me stay with them until I got back on my feet. I was beyond grateful for the help, and I made sure to contribute however I could, helping with cooking, cleaning, and buying groceries whenever I could afford it. Fast forward about 6 months, I finally landed a better job, which allowed me to contribute more financially, and I was starting to become independent. Around the same time, Karen got pregnant, and at first, everything seemed fine. However, soon Karen started dropping subtle hints that they would need more space for the baby. At first, it was small comments, but eventually, it turned into direct conversations about how they needed the guest room for a nursery. Tom reassured me that I could stay until I found another place, but Karen was clearly getting more and more irritated. Then, one day, I came home from work to find all my things packed up and sitting in the hallway. Tom told me that Karen had decided they needed me out as soon as possible. No discussion, no warning. He tried to soften the blow by offering to help with the security deposit for a new place, but it was humiliating and painful. I ended up couch surfing for a few months until I could afford a small studio apartment. It was a really rough time for me, both emotionally and financially. I'll never forget the feeling of being thrown out like that, especially by my own brother. Now, fast forward to the present. Tom's life hasn't exactly gone as planned. His business failed, and now they're having serious financial issues. Last week, he called me out of nowhere, sounding desperate. They're being evicted from their house and have nowhere to go. He asked if he, Karen, and their 2 kids could stay with me for a few months until they get back on their feet. The thing is, I'm doing much better now. I have a stable job, a nice apartment, and I've been saving for a house. Technically, I could accommodate them, but the idea of letting them move in after how they treated me years ago just doesn't feel right. I told Tom I needed time to think about it, but ever since then, he's been sending me guilt-laden messages about how family is supposed to be there for each other and how they have nowhere else to go. Even my parents have gotten involved, saying I should let them stay because they're family. And what happened back then is in the past. Here's the kicker, though. Karen hasn't apologized for how they treated me. Not once. She didn't even acknowledge it during our phone conversation. It feels like they just expect me to forget about it and welcome them back into my life like nothing ever happened. Part of me feels like I should help them because they are family, but another part of me feels like this is karmic justice. AETA for refusing to let them stay with me after what happened? Or should I just let it go and help them out in their time of need? Update 1. It has been a whirlwind since my original post. I read through every single comment, and it really gave me some clarity. I decided that before making any decisions, I needed to talk to Tom face to face. I invited him over for a coffee, just the 2 of us, so we could have an honest conversation without Karen present. I started by telling him how hurt I was about what happened all those years ago. I reminded him that I never received an apology from either of them, and how difficult it was for me to be kicked out with no warning. I laid it all out there, not holding anything back. I was expecting Tom to get defensive, but instead, he looked defeated. He said he was sorry for how things turned out, but explained that it was all Karen's idea to force me out. He claimed that at the time, he was trying to keep peace in his marriage and felt caught between his wife and me. He admitted that it was a cowardly move and that he regretted how everything went down. That was something, at least. But then I brought up Karen. I asked him why she hadn't apologized or acknowledged what happened. Tom sighed and said that Karen doesn't think she did anything wrong. According to him, she felt like I had overstayed my welcome and that it was her right to prioritize her family, especially with a baby on the way. He said that Karen wasn't likely to ever apologize because she genuinely believed she made the right decision back then. This was the confirmation I needed. I told Tom that I wasn't comfortable with them moving in, especially given Karen's attitude. Tom didn't take it well. He looked crushed and tried to argue, but I stood my ground. I said that I didn't think I could live under the same roof as someone who hadn't even acknowledged the hurt they caused me. Tom left my apartment looking completely defeated. After that conversation, I thought things would die down, but boy, was I wrong. A couple of days later, my parents called me absolutely furious. Tom had gone straight to them, telling them how I refused to help. They accused me of being selfish and holding on to a grudge, saying that I was punishing Tom and Karen for something that happened years ago. According to them, I should be the bigger person and let it go. I tried to explain my side, but they weren't having it. My mom even went as far as to say that I was ruining the family by not helping them. I hung up feeling completely drained. The guilt they were piling on was overwhelming. But here's the kicker. Later that night, I got a text from an unknown number. It was Karen. All it said was, "I heard you won't let us stay with you. I guess some people never change." That text sent me into a rage. Some people never change? The audacity. After everything they did to me, she still didn't see her role in all of it. I haven't responded to the text yet, and I'm trying to figure out my next move. Part of me wants to blow up on her, but another part of me knows that won't solve anything. I'm just so tired of this whole situation. Update 2. After spending a few more days away, I finally decided to go back home to have one last conversation with my husband before making a final decision. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, to see if maybe he had taken some time to reflect on everything that had happened. A small part of me was still hoping that we could somehow salvage our marriage, but I knew deep down that the damage might already be too severe. When I walked through the door, the house felt different. There was a strange emptiness in the air, like the warmth that once filled our home had disappeared. My husband was sitting on the couch, watching TV, and barely acknowledged me when I walked in. It was as if my absence hadn't affected him at all. I dropped my bag and sat down next to him, trying to gauge his mood, but he kept his eyes glued to the screen. I asked him if we could talk, and he sighed, clearly annoyed that I was interrupting his show. Right away, I felt my heart sink. This was not the reaction of someone who cared about fixing things. I told him that we needed to address everything that had been left unsaid, and that I couldn't move forward without some real answers. To my surprise, he agreed to talk, but what followed was not the conversation I had been hoping for. Instead of taking any accountability for his actions, he doubled down on his dismissiveness. He told me that I was making a big deal out of nothing, that I was being too emotional, and that he didn't see why our cultural differences should be such a problem in our relationship. His tone was cold and indifferent, and I could feel myself growing more frustrated by the second. I asked him why he had lied to his family about the trip, why he had painted my parents in such an unflattering light when they had done everything they could to make him feel welcome. His response was infuriating. He said that he didn't think it mattered how he described the trip because no one really cares about that stuff. He brushed off my feelings like they were insignificant, and that was when I realized that he had never really respected me or my family in the first place. It became clear to me in that moment that I had been holding on to a version of him that didn't exist anymore, if it ever existed at all. The man I had fallen in love with was kind, compassionate, and open-minded, but the man sitting in front of me was the complete opposite. It was like I was seeing him for who he truly was, and it broke my heart. But then things took an unexpected turn. As we were talking, my husband's phone rang, and he glanced at the screen before quickly silencing it. I noticed that he seemed a little flustered, which was unusual for him. I asked him who it was, and he brushed it off, saying it was just a friend from work. But something about the way he acted made me suspicious. Later that night, after he had gone to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I knew it wasn't healthy to go through his phone, but my gut was telling me that there was more to this story than he was letting on. So, against my better judgment, I unlocked his phone and went through his messages. What I found left me in shock. There, in his text messages, was a long conversation with a woman I didn't recognize. The messages weren't explicitly romantic, but they were certainly flirtatious. They had been texting for weeks, maybe even months, and the tone of their conversations made it clear that there was something going on between them. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the messages, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had he been emotionally cheating on me this whole time? I confronted him the next morning, and at first he tried to deny it. But when I showed him the messages, he couldn't lie anymore. He admitted that he had been texting this woman for a while, but he swore that nothing physical had ever happened. He said that they were just friends, and that he turned to her because he felt like I was too distant lately. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was trying to shift the blame onto me, as if his emotional affair was somehow my fault. I told him that it didn't matter whether or not things had gotten physical. The fact that he had been turning to another woman for emotional support was a betrayal in itself. I had been pouring my heart into trying to fix our marriage, and he had been secretly confiding in someone else the whole time. That was the final nail in the coffin for me. I told him that I couldn't stay in a marriage where I wasn't respected or valued, and that his emotional affair was the last straw. He didn't even seem all that upset. He just shrugged and said that maybe we were better off apart. It was like he had already checked out of the relationship long before I had even realized what was going on. The next few days were a blur. I packed up some of my things and went back to my friend's place, and we agreed to separate. We haven't officially filed for divorce yet, but I know that's where this is headed. I'm still in shock over everything that has happened, but at the same time, I feel a strange sense of relief. It's like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders. For so long, I had been holding on to the hope that things would get better, but now I see that I was holding on to a fantasy. Since the separation, I've started to focus more on myself and my own healing. I've reconnected with some friends I hadn't seen in a while, and I've been spending more time with my parents, who have been incredibly supportive throughout all of this. I still haven't told them about the emotional affair, but I think they suspect that something more happened than just a cultural clash. They've been nothing but understanding, and I'm so grateful to have them in my life. As for my husband, I haven't heard much from him since I left. We exchanged a few texts about logistics, but that's about it. He seems content to let things play out without putting in any real effort to save our marriage, and that only reinforces my belief that I'm making the right decision by leaving. I'm still heartbroken over how everything turned out, but I'm also starting to feel hopeful for the future. For the first time in a long time, I'm putting myself and my own happiness first, and that feels empowering. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I deserve to be with someone who values and respects me, and I'm not going to settle for anything less. Update 3. It's been a couple of months since my last update, and I wanted to wait until I had some real clarity before coming back here. A lot has happened since I last posted, and I can't say any of it has been easy. After spending time away from my husband and staying with my friend, I finally returned home with a decision. I needed to separate from him, at least temporarily, but things didn't go the way I thought they would. When I went back to the house, I was fully prepared to have the conversation I had been dreading. I walked in, mentally rehearsing what I would say, trying to stay calm and firm. But what I wasn't prepared for was to find someone else already there. I hadn't even closed the door when I heard voices coming from the living room. One of them was my husband's, but the other was distinctly feminine, and it wasn't his mother's voice. I froze. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, before deciding to confront the situation head-on. I walked into the living room, and there she was, one of his co-workers, someone I had met a few times at his company's events. She was sitting on our couch, laughing at something he had said, and my husband looked way too comfortable. I was stunned. They both stopped talking the moment they saw me, and the silence that followed was suffocating. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my mind was spinning. My husband stammered, clearly caught off guard, and then gave the worst possible response he could have come up with. "Oh, she just came over to help me with some work stuff," he said. That lame excuse didn't explain why she was sitting on our couch with her shoes off, or why they had been laughing together like they were the only two people in the world. I didn't even want to hear more. I grabbed my bag, turned around, and walked right back out of the house. I didn't want to stay there another minute. All those feelings of hurt and disrespect that had been building up over the past few months suddenly exploded, and I couldn't believe I had let it get to this point. I felt so foolish. How had I not seen this coming? I went back to my friend's house, and this time, I wasn't planning on going back. That night, I did something I probably should have done a long time ago. I called my mom. I hadn't wanted to burden her with my problems before, but I couldn't handle this alone anymore. I told her everything. The way my husband had acted during the trip, the hurtful comments he made about my family, and now, this new betrayal. My mom listened quietly as I vented, and when I finally finished, she said something that shook me to my core. Maybe it's time to come home. I hadn't even considered it before. Home had always felt so far away, both physically and emotionally. But when my mom said those words, something clicked inside me. I realized I had been holding on to a life that no longer felt like mine, a marriage that was suffocating me. And maybe what I needed wasn't just space from my husband, but a complete break from the life we had built together. I hadn't thought about returning to my home country as a real option, but now, it seemed like the only thing that made sense. I spent the next few days thinking about my mom's suggestion, and the more I thought about it, the more it felt right. I called my parents and told them I was seriously considering coming back, at least for a few months to clear my head. They were supportive, as they always are, and told me their doors were always open. My dad even joked that he would take me on a grand tour of the city again, just like he had with my husband during that infamous trip. The thought of being surrounded by my family, in a place where I felt loved and valued, brought me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. When I finally spoke to my husband again, it wasn't the conversation I had imagined. I told him I was leaving, but instead of the temporary separation I had planned, I told him I was going back to my home country. His reaction was exactly what I expected: indifference. He didn't fight for our marriage. He didn't try to convince me to stay. Instead, he just said, "Do what you need to do," like it didn't matter to him either way. That hurt more than anything else. The fact that he wasn't willing to fight for us made me realize that this marriage was already over. I packed my things and made arrangements to fly home. It wasn't easy saying goodbye to the life I had built here, but I knew I was doing the right thing. Before I left, I filed for legal separation, and I've already spoken to a lawyer about divorce. I'm not rushing into anything, but I'm also not waiting around for my husband to suddenly become the person I need him to be. I deserve better than that, and I'm finally starting to believe it. Now that I'm back home with my family, I feel like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders. I'm still processing everything that happened, and I know I have a long road ahead of me. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. My parents have been amazing, and my mom has been cooking all my favorite meals, just like she used to when I was growing up. It feels good to be surrounded by people who love me unconditionally, without any judgment or expectations. As for my husband, I haven't heard much from him since I left. He sent a few texts asking if I got to my destination safely, but that's it. No apologies, no attempts to fix things, just silence. Part of me is still hurt by how easily he let me go, but another part of me is relieved. I'm done fighting for someone who doesn't care enough to fight for me. Looking back, I realize how much I had compromised in this relationship. I had let my husband's indifference and disrespect slide for so long because I didn't want to be the difficult one, the one who made things uncomfortable. But now I see that I was only hurting myself by staying silent. I deserve to be with someone who values me, my family, and my culture, not someone who sees it as a burden. I'm still figuring out what the future holds, but for now, I'm focusing on healing and rebuilding my life. Being back home has given me a new sense of clarity, and I'm grateful for that. I don't know what will happen with the divorce, or if my husband will ever come around and realize what he lost, but at this point, it doesn't really matter. I'm finally at peace with my decision to leave, and that's all that matters.